This is John. Welcome to Chess Dog. Today in the candidates, Ding Liren came in clear second place, and he was playing against Radjabov in the game today. Ding Liren had the white pieces, Radjabov had the black pieces, and it was a very impressive game. Let's take a look. Ding Liren begins by playing d4, Radjabov plays knight f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, and Radjabov plays bishop to b4, a Nimzo Indian. Ding Liren plays e3, the Rubinstein variation. Castles, bishop to d3, d5, cd5, ed5. And now we have the Carlsbad structure with white's pawns pointing towards the queen side and black's pawns pointing towards the king side. But you'll notice the dark squared bishops aren't really that well placed for either side. The bishop at b4 isn't all that well placed, and the bishop at c1 is really quite poorly placed, blocked in by the pawn at e3. The main move here for white is knight g to e2 to help support this knight and perhaps advance in the center with f3 and e4. But instead, Ding Liren plays a3 to kick that bishop away. The bishop moves to d6, and then queen to c2, helps control the e4 square and aims at h7. And Radjabov plays knight to a6. And the idea behind playing this knight to the side of the board is to support the move c7, c5. Usually it creates an isolated queen's pawn position, but black has dynamic compensation. Ding Liren plays knight g to e2, and now c5. So here, Ding Liren makes a big decision. He decides to play bishop takes knight, which damages black's pawn structure. Another possibility would be b3 to help control the c4 square. But by taking the knight, he definitely changes the character of the game. After pawn takes bishop, black's pawn structure is worse. There's no doubt about it. After pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes c5. However, if you look closely, black has the two bishops, and this pawn perhaps can advance to d4. Also, black's king is castled, and white's king is still in the center of the board. So black gets dynamic compensation for the pawn weaknesses. And still, look at white's queen side. This bishop and rook are not yet developed, and the bishop's going to have a hard time finding a home. Now here, Ding Liren played b4, which was the novelty of the game, and the commentators definitely criticized this move. The safer move would be to just castle, with the idea of playing the rook f1 to d1 to control d4 and put pressure on the d5 pawn. That would have been safer. b4, the bishop goes back to d6, and bishop to b2. Now it's a bit dangerous to castle here. If you see, black has a lot of easy attacking moves. The bishop at d6 aims at h7. The knight can go to g4, the bishop at c8's involved, and you see all these lines I have on the screen just showing how many easy attacking moves black has in that position. So Ding Liren plays bishop to b2 instead, placing the bishop on the long diagonal. a5, attacking black's b4 point and getting rid of one of those pawn weaknesses that Radjabov has on the queen side. b5, a6, h3, bishop to d7, and after pawn takes pawn, rook takes a6, one of those pawn weaknesses has been eliminated for black. Also, the rook on a6, being on black's third rank, can become a very potent attacking piece later in the game if it's able to slide into a rook lift over to the king side. Rook to d1, rook to b6. Now this puts pressure on the b2 bishop, and if black is able to play queen to b8, he will be really lined up against that bishop and also the king side. And Ding Liren is already in a bit of a pickle here. He's got a tough decision to make. How does he deal with the threat of queen to b8 hitting that bishop? The computer's recommendation is actually to go ahead and play bishop to a1 and just give up the a3 pawn. So the computer does not like white's position at all. It thinks it's willing to give up a pawn just to relieve the pressure a little bit. And castling is far too dangerous. Then queen to c8 lines up the queen. The knight on c3 is pinned, and also Radjabov has all sorts of potential sacrifices on h3 that would just be crushing. So Ding Liren decides to defend it laterally by playing the rook to d2. Now queen to c8 anyway, again pinning the knight and making it far too dangerous for white to castle. If he castles, he'd castle right into that bishop h3 sacrifice. But here Ding Liren plays f3. If he castles, just bishop takes h3. The computer actually does recommend this as the best option, not because it's good, but it's just the best option available. And here to just play queen to d3. If he played pawn takes bishop, then just queen h3 with a threat of knight to g4, and he would just be lost. But queen to d3, just accepting the pawn down position is the computer's recommendation. But Ding Liren plays the move f3. And this leaves his dark squares chronically weak. And Radjabov just gets ready to invade on those squares. He plays rook to e8, immediately threatening the e3 pawn. Ding Liren defends that pawn with his king, with king to f2. Another way to have defended it was knight to d1, but also this would be insufficient. After rook c6, hitting the queen, queen to b1, queen to b8. You see the queen and bishop aiming to get in on these dark squares. Then castles, bishop takes a3. There's a pin on the bishop at b2, and black is just winning in that position. So Ding Liren defends with the king, queen to b8, the same move, queen to c1, and then rook takes e3, and the rook cannot be taken. If the king takes the rook, then just bishop to c5, check. If king to d3, bishop to f5, check. He's in the crisscross pattern of those bishops, and he's just in huge trouble. He'd have to play knight e4, then pawn takes, king c2, e3, discovered check, and that would be curtains. If after bishop c5 check he blocks with the knight, then just queen to e5 check, king f2, bishop to d4, and that would be it. So the rook cannot be taken. So Ding Liren plays the knight to d1. The rook retreats back to e8, having done its work. Knight to e3, now rook to b3. The two rooks hit the knight, and something has to be done. If he plays the knight to d1, then knight to h5, and he's penetrating again on those dark squares. f4, f4 and g3. He plays knight to g4 instead. Radjabov takes the knight with the bishop, hg4, now rook to c8, aiming right at the queen on c1. Queen moves to a1, and then bishop to f4, and in this position, with his king side in big trouble, Ding Liren resigned. Black is threatening the rook on d1, and there's simply no good choice to make. Let's say he moves the rook d to d1, then bishop to e3 check, king f1, rook takes knight. He needs that rook to defend the bishop at b2. If he just takes the bishop, then queen takes knight, and he's still aiming at the rook. If rook goes to e2, then just knight takes g4 check, and the pawn cannot take the knight because it is pinned, and that would be all there is to it. And if bishop takes f6, queen takes d2 check. A really brilliant game from Radjabov. A painful loss for Ding Liren, and this game pretty much seals the deal. Nepomniachtchi will almost certainly now be the victor in the Candidates 2022. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.